Right now, somewhere over southern Iran, there are bridges that don't exist anymore. Not damaged, not partially standing, gone. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly why the United States just made a decision that changes the entire shape of this war. Because for the first time since this conflict started, the target list wasn't ships, it wasn't radar towers, it wasn't missile silos buried under a mountain somewhere. It was the roads, it was the power grid, it was the actual skeleton that holds Iran's economy and Iran's military together. And if you're the kind of person who thinks a war is only about explosions on a battlefield, you're about to learn why bridges and power plants might be the most devastating targets of all. So let's set the scene, because the timeline actually matters here. For about a week straight, the United States had been running a fairly conventional campaign. Strikes on coastal radar, strikes on fast attack boats, strikes on missile and drone storage, standard to grade the threat playbook. Then President Trump did something that a lot of analysts didn't expect. He didn't just threaten more strikes, he named the target category out loud, publicly, ahead of time. He said in no uncertain terms that if Iran didn't reopen the Strait of Hormuz, the bridges and the power plants were next. That's not normal. Militaries don't usually pre-announce infrastructure targeting. It's either a mind game, a genuine ultimatum, or both. And then Iran didn't blink. The strait stayed choked off. Shipping traffic dropped to some of the lowest numbers of the entire conflict. Just a handful of vessels a day crossing a waterway that, in peacetime, carries roughly a fifth of the entire planet's oil and gas. So the deadline came. And the deadline was kept. Overnight, the strikes hit. Multiple highway and railway bridges around Bandar Abbas, Iran's most important port on the southern coast, were taken out. One bridge that was reportedly still under construction. Another, a rail bridge connecting Bandar Abbas toward the interior, toward Shiraz, toward the routes that feed the capital. Think about what that means for a second. Bandar Abbas isn't just a port, it's the artery. It's how Iran moves military hardware from the coast inland, and it's how Iran moves regular civilian goods to 90 million people. You sever that connection, and you're not fighting a battle anymore. You're strangling a logistics network in real time. A railway junction just west of the port was hit too. That's the kind of target that doesn't make for dramatic explosion footage on the news. But strategically, it might be more damaging than a missile site, because missile sites can be rebuilt or relocated. A collapsed bridge over a river gorge takes months, sometimes years. And then there's the power plants. This is the part that should actually worry people watching this conflict from the outside, because striking a nation's energy grid is one of the most escalatory things a modern military can do without crossing into full occupation-style warfare. Energy infrastructure runs everything. It runs air defense radar, it runs command and control centers, it runs hospitals, it runs water treatment. When Trump said Iran's power plants were on the table, he wasn't talking about some symbolic gesture. He was talking about flipping the lights off on an entire regime's ability to function as a modern state during wartime. Now, before I go further, let's talk about what this looked like on the ground, because Iranian state media put out casualty figures almost immediately. And whatever side of this you land on, those numbers are real people. Reports out of Iran cited multiple fatalities, and dozens wounded from the infrastructure strikes specifically, separate from the ongoing military strikes elsewhere in the country. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that doesn't matter, just because this is a war against a regime that has spent decades funding proxy militias, hostage diplomacy, and attacks on commercial shipping. Civilians in Iran didn't necessarily choose this regime's foreign policy, and every time a bridge goes down, there's a chance somebody's vehicle was on it. That's the cost of this kind of war, and it's worth sitting with for a second before we move into the tactical breakdown, because I think a lot of channels skip straight past that part, and I don't want to be one of them. All right, so if you're new here, this is exactly the kind of channel where we go past the press release and actually break down what's happening operationally, how the platforms work together, what the strategy actually looks like from 30,000 feet. So if that's your thing, go ahead and hit subscribe right now before we get into it, because I'm going to be tracking every single night of this as it unfolds, and you don't want to be catching up 3 weeks late on something that's moving this fast. Let's talk about how you actually take down a modern bridge and a hardened power facility in the same rotation, because these aren't soft targets. Iran has had years, honestly decades, to prepare its infrastructure against exactly this kind of scenario. Bridges in a conflict zone this significant are often flanked by air defense, sometimes mobile, short-range systems that can reposition on short notice. Power plants, especially ones tied to military-relevant grid sectors, tend to get prioritized for whatever air defense assets a country has left. So striking both categories in the same window means you almost certainly needed a suppression package running first. That's usually where electronic warfare aircraft or specialized radar hunting jets come in, going in ahead of the main strike package to blind or destroy whatever's left of the local air defense picture. Once that corridor opens up, you send in precision-guided munitions carried by multi-role fighters, and for the harder targets, the ones with reinforced structural elements like major bridge supports or turbine halls at a power facility, you're looking at larger penetrating munitions, the kind designed to defeat structural mass rather than just create a surface explosion. Here's the part that I think gets lost in most of the coverage. Taking down a bridge isn't actually about the explosion looking impressive. It's about hitting the load-bearing structure in exactly the right place, so the whole span becomes physically unusable, ideally in a way that makes repair extremely difficult, not just inconvenient. A strike that just cracks the surface of a bridge deck gets patched in a week. A strike that drops a central support pylon can put that bridge out of commission for the rest of the war and well beyond it. The same logic applies to power infrastructure. You don't need to level the entire plant. You need to take out the transformer yard, the turbine hall, or the switching station, because those are the components that are actually hard to replace under sanctions and wartime import restrictions. Iran can't exactly place a rush order for replacement turbines from a European manufacturer right now. So even a single precise hit on the right piece of equipment can take a power facility offline for months, sometimes longer, especially if the country doesn't have the industrial base to manufacture replacement parts domestically. Now let's talk about Iran's response, because this is where things get genuinely dangerous for the wider region. Iran didn't just absorb these strikes, it fired back, and it fired back at exactly the kind of target that could pull more countries into this fight. Missiles were launched at U.S. allied nations in the Gulf, and one of those strikes reportedly damaged a power and water desalination facility in Kuwait. Stop and think about what that actually means for a country like Kuwait. In a desert nation, a desalination plant isn't a luxury utility, it's the water supply. Damaging one is functionally an attack on the civilian population's ability to access clean water, and that is an enormous escalation, because it drags a country that was mostly playing a hosting and logistics role directly into the list of nations absorbing physical damage from this war. Qatar was also targeted around the same window, and Qatar has spent this entire conflict trying to walk an incredibly difficult line, acting as one of the key mediators trying to broker some kind of off-ramp between Washington and Tehran, all while getting shot at by the very regime it's trying to help negotiate a ceasefire for. There were reports of a civilian, a child, wounded by shrapnel from an intercepted missile in Qatar during this same stretch, which tells you everything you need to know about how even successful intercepts still generate real-world casualties from falling debris. So, here's the shape of the board right now, and I want to walk through this carefully because I think this is the piece that most coverage misses. The United States escalated from military-industrial targets to civilian-adjacent infrastructure, bridges and power plants, specifically because the Strait of Hormuz remained closed. That's the trigger. Iran, rather than negotiating an opening of the strait, responded by escalating horizontally, hitting infrastructure in third-party countries that aren't even the primary combatant. That's a very specific and very risky move, because it turns Kuwait and Qatar from bystander hosts into active targets. And once a regional power starts taking damage on its own soil, the pressure for that country to respond militarily, or at minimum to permanently reposition its relationship with Iran, goes up enormously. Iran's own foreign ministry has been publicly framing the U.S. infrastructure strikes as attacks on civilian targets, essentially trying to build an international narrative around the idea that Washington crossed a line by hitting bridges and power plants rather than purely military assets. Meanwhile, Iran continues to frame its own strikes on commercial shipping and on neighboring Gulf states as acts of self-defense. You can decide for yourself how consistent that framing actually is, but it tells you Tehran knows exactly how this looks on the world stage and is trying to get ahead of the narrative. I want to pause here for a second because I think it's worth being honest about something. A lot of channels covering this conflict either go full cheerleader for one side or full doom and gloom about the whole thing being a catastrophe. I'm not going to do either of those. What I want to do is actually walk you through what the decision-making looks like from both capitals, because that's the only way any of this actually makes sense as a sequence of events, instead of just a highlight reel of explosions. From Washington's perspective, the logic is fairly linear. The Strait of Hormuz closing isn't just a regional problem, it's a global economic problem. A meaningful percentage of the planet's oil and natural gas moves through that waterway in peacetime, and every day it stays constrained. Energy markets everywhere feel it. Allies feel it. And the argument inside the administration becomes that limited strikes on military assets clearly weren't enough leverage to force Iran back to the table. So you escalate to infrastructure that the regime actually depends on to function, betting that the economic and logistical pain will outweigh Tehran's willingness to keep the strait closed. It's coercive pressure, dialed up in stages, each stage designed to raise the cost of continued defiance without crossing into what would be considered full regime change warfare, at least not officially. From Tehran's perspective, the logic is almost the mirror image. The regime has spent years building a doctrine around asymmetric response, meaning when you can't match your adversary's air power directly, you respond by imposing costs somewhere else, whether that's shipping lanes, regional bases, or now, apparently, infrastructure belonging to countries that are hosting or mediating on behalf of Washington. Every strike on Kuwait or Qatar is a message aimed less at those countries directly and more at the broader Gulf. A signal that says, if you continue hosting American operations or pressuring us diplomatically, you're not going to be spared just because you're not the primary combatant. It's a dangerous strategy because it risks turning countries that were previously neutral-leaning into full participants, but it's also, from Iran's position, one of the only levers left when your own air defense and command infrastructure is being systematically dismantled night after night. All right, before we get into the strategic outlook for where this actually goes next, I want to make sure you're not missing anything as this thing develops night by night, because the pace of this conflict has genuinely been unpredictable, and stuff is shifting fast enough that a video from even 4 or 5 days ago is already outdated. So if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn notifications on, because I'm putting these breakdowns out as things develop, not on some fixed weekly schedule. And I don't want you finding out about a major turning point 3 days after everyone else already knows. Let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz for a minute, because everything in this entire conflict ultimately loops back to that single stretch of water. Shipping traffic through the strait has fallen to some of the lowest levels recorded during this entire war, with reports of daily vessel crossings dropping into the single digits on certain days, a fraction of what would normally move through there in peacetime. That's not a minor disruption. That's a functional blockade, even if nobody's officially using that word. Insurance costs for vessels attempting the crossing have reportedly spiked. Shipping companies are rerouting or simply refusing contracts through the region. And every day that continues, the economic pressure compounds. This is exactly why the infrastructure strikes matter so much strategically. Washington's bet is that hitting bridges and power plants creates enough internal pressure inside Iran, disrupted logistics, unreliable electricity, damaged transportation routes, that the calculus around keeping the strait closed eventually flips. Tehran's bet is that it can absorb that pressure, keep escalating against regional targets, and outlast the political will in Washington and in the Gulf states hosting American operations. Here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. Wars that escalate through infrastructure targeting have a historical pattern, and it's not a great one. Once you start hitting power grids and transportation networks instead of purely military assets, the war starts to bleed into the civilian population's daily life in ways that are much harder to walk back. You can rebuild a destroyed radar site relatively quickly if the political will and funding exist. Rebuilding a national grid or a bridge network connecting your only major deepwater port to the rest of the country takes years, sometimes a full generation, especially under sanctions that restrict access to specialized parts and international financing. So even if a ceasefire happens next month, next week, whenever it happens, Iran is going to be dealing with the downstream consequences of this specific phase of the war for a very long time. That's true regardless of how you feel about who started it or who's more at fault. Infrastructure damage doesn't disappear when the fighting stops. Now let's zoom out to the regional level, because I think this is genuinely the most important thread to watch over the next week. Kuwait and Qatar getting hit changes their political calculus permanently, even if both countries publicly maintain a posture of restraint, and so far they largely have. There's now a domestic political reality inside both of those governments, where their own populations watched a desalination plant get damaged, or watched intercepted missile debris injure a child. That kind of thing creates internal pressure on leadership that doesn't just evaporate, because a ceasefire gets announced somewhere down the line. Gulf states that were previously trying to stay as neutral as possible while quietly hosting American assets are now facing the reality that neutrality itself has a cost in this war. And that shifts alliances, defense spending priorities, and diplomatic posture in ways that will likely outlast this specific conflict by years. There's also the question of what comes next on the target list, because if bridges and power plants were the threshold that got crossed this week, the obvious next question is what's left that hasn't been hit yet. Communications infrastructure has already taken damage in earlier phases of this conflict. Command centers have been hit repeatedly. Ballistic missile and drone storage sites have been degraded night after night. If the strait remains closed and Iran continues its pattern of horizontal escalation against Gulf neighbors, the pressure inside Washington to expand the target list even further is almost certainly going to build. Whether that means more infrastructure, deeper strikes closer to population centers, or an entirely different category of target, that's the genuinely uncertain part. And it's exactly why I think the next 72 hours matter more than almost any other window in this entire conflict so far. I also want to flag something that doesn't get talked about enough in most of the coverage, and that's the economic ripple effect well beyond the region. Every time the strait constricts further, global energy markets react. And that reaction doesn't stay contained to oil futures traders watching a screen somewhere. It moves through fuel prices, through shipping insurance, through every supply chain that touches energy costs, which at this point is basically every supply chain that exists. So even people who have never thought about the Strait of Hormuz in their entire lives are going to start feeling this indirectly if the closure drags on much longer. That's part of why the infrastructure escalation matters so much strategically. It's not just about Iran's internal capacity to keep fighting. It's about how long the rest of the world is willing to tolerate the economic side effects of this standoff before there's serious international pressure pushing for a resolution one way or another. So here's where I actually land on all of this, and I want to be straightforward about the uncertainty here, rather than pretending I know exactly how it plays out, because nobody actually does right now. The infrastructure strikes represent a genuine escalation in both scale and intent. This isn't purely a military campaign against hardware anymore. It's coercive pressure aimed at the functional backbone of a country. And that kind of pressure tends to produce one of two outcomes historically. Either it breaks the target's will to continue fairly quickly because the internal cost becomes unbearable, or it hardens resistance and produces exactly the kind of horizontal escalation we're already seeing against Kuwait and Qatar, dragging more actors into the conflict and making any negotiated off-ramp significantly harder to reach. Right now, the early signs point more toward the second outcome than the first. Iran hasn't shown any indication of reopening the strait, and its response to the infrastructure strikes was to hit civilian-adjacent targets in third-party countries, rather than seek negotiation. That's not a great sign for anyone hoping this resolves quickly. What I'll be watching most closely over the coming days is whether Kuwait and Qatar's posture shifts from hosting and mediating towards something more directly involved, because that's the tripwire that turns a two-party war into a genuinely regional one. I'll also be watching whether the U.S. expands the infrastructure target list further, because if bridges and power plants weren't enough to change Tehran's calculus on the strait, the next category of pressure is going to be an even bigger story than this one. If you want to stay ahead of this as it develops, this is exactly the kind of situation where following along in real time actually matters. Because the difference between understanding this conflict and just seeing headlines about it usually comes down to catching the details in the days between the big, dramatic strikes. So go ahead and hit that follow button. Drop a comment with what you think happens next. Whether you think Iran caves on the strait, whether you think this drags Kuwait and Qatar deeper into direct involvement, or whether you think this is the beginning of something that expands well past the region entirely. I read every single comment. And honestly, some of the best analysis on this channel comes from discussions that start down there, so don't be shy. Let's go a little deeper on Bandar Abbas specifically, because I don't think people outside the region fully appreciate just how central this one port actually is to Iran's entire wartime posture. This isn't some secondary harbor. It's Iran's primary link to the open ocean on the southern coast, the place where naval assets stage, where a huge share of imports and exports physically move through, and where the geography itself puts you within very short range of the Strait of Hormuz choke point. When you cut the bridges and rail lines connecting Bandar Abbas to the interior, you're not just inconveniencing truck drivers, you're isolating the one port that matters most in this entire conflict from the rest of the country's supply and command network. Anything that needs to move from the coast toward Tehran, whether that's military hardware being repositioned, spare parts, fuel, or basic goods for the civilian population, now has to find an alternate route. And alternate routes take longer, cost more, and are far easier to monitor and interdict. That's the quiet, unglamorous version of what a bridge strike actually accomplishes. It doesn't look as dramatic on camera as a missile hitting a command bunker, but in terms of actual strategic effect over the following weeks and months, severing that corridor might end up mattering more than half the kinetic strikes we've seen so far in this war. And that ties directly into something worth unpacking a bit further, which is the difference between a military campaign designed to win a war outright versus one designed purely to extract a concession. Everything about the way this administration has sequenced its targeting suggests the second category. You don't threaten a specific category of target publicly, give a deadline, and then follow through exactly on schedule if your goal is unconditional victory or regime collapse. That's the playbook for coercive diplomacy through military pressure. It's the language of an ultimatum, not an invasion plan. Trump named the target category, gave Iran a window to comply by reopening the strait, and when that window closed without compliance, the strikes landed exactly where he said they would. That kind of predictability is actually a deliberate signal. It tells Tehran, and honestly it tells the rest of the world watching, that future threats from this administration in this conflict are not just rhetoric, they're operational plans with a trigger condition already built in, which raises an uncomfortable question for whatever comes next. If the next ultimatum gets ignored too, what's the next category of target that gets named out loud in advance? I also want to spend a minute on something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in most of the coverage. And that's the psychological and informational dimension of hitting infrastructure like this. When you take out a bridge or damage a power facility, you're not just achieving a physical effect, you're also generating a very specific kind of footage and narrative that both sides are going to use for the rest of this war. Iranian state media moved almost immediately to publicize casualty figures and frame the strikes as attacks on civilian infrastructure, which is a deliberate attempt to shape international opinion and put pressure on Washington from outside actors, from other governments, from international bodies, from public opinion in allied nations that might start questioning continued support for this campaign. Meanwhile, U.S. and allied messaging has focused heavily on the dual-use nature of a lot of this infrastructure, arguing that a rail junction feeding a port that also handles military logistics isn't purely civilian in any meaningful sense. Both of these narratives are doing real work in this conflict, arguably as much work as the missiles themselves, because wars like this one are increasingly won or lost not just on the battlefield, but in the court of international and domestic public opinion, and infrastructure strikes generate exactly the kind of visceral, easily shareable footage that dominates that fight. There's also a financial angle here that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. Every bridge and every power facility that goes down has a direct dollar cost attached to eventual reconstruction, and Iran is trying to fund that reconstruction, along with the rest of its wartime economy, while operating under one of the most extensive sanctions regimes on the planet. That means limited access to international financing, limited ability to import specialized construction materials or replacement equipment for damaged power infrastructure, and a shrinking pool of trading partners willing to engage given the current climate. Every additional week this war continues, and every additional piece of infrastructure that gets added to the damage list compounds that reconstruction bill in a way that's going to outlast the actual fighting by years, possibly longer than a full decade, depending on how extensive the final damage list ends up being. That's the part of this war that won't show up in nightly strike footage, but it's arguably the most consequential long-term outcome of the entire conflict. Let's also talk briefly about how this specific moment fits into the broader pattern we've seen across the last several weeks of this war, because there's a rhythm to it if you zoom out far enough. Early strikes focused almost entirely on hard military targets, coastal radar, fast attack boats, missile and drone storage sites. Then the campaign shifted toward command and communications infrastructure, hitting the nodes that let Iran's military actually coordinate a response in real time. Now we've moved into economic and civil infrastructure, bridges and power plants specifically tied to the ongoing standoff over the Strait of Hormuz. Each phase has targeted something a little further from the pure battlefield and a little closer to the actual functioning of the state itself. If that pattern holds, and there's no strong indication yet that it's going to reverse, the next phase of escalation, if the Strait situation doesn't resolve, is likely to move even closer to the core systems that keep the country running day to day. That's not a comfortable thing to say out loud, but it's the trajectory the evidence is currently pointing toward, and I'd rather be upfront with you about that than pretend this is winding down when the actual pattern suggests the opposite. One more thing worth sitting with before we wrap this one up. Wars that escalate through infrastructure targeting tend to create their own momentum, almost independent of the original strategic goal. Once bridges start falling and power plants start going offline, both sides develop a kind of sunk cost mentality where de-escalating starts to feel like it would waste everything already spent, politically, economically, and in terms of casualties already absorbed. That's part of why ceasefire negotiations get harder, not easier, the longer an infrastructure campaign like this one continues. Every side has more to justify, more damage to point to as evidence the fight was worth it, and less appetite to walk away without something that can be framed domestically as a win. That dynamic is exactly why I think the next week matters so much, because the longer this specific phase continues without a clear resolution on the Strait, the more entrenched both sides are likely to become, and the harder any eventual off-ramp is going to be to actually reach. That's where we're at right now. Bridges down, power infrastructure damaged, a strait that's still closed, two Gulf allies that just got pulled further into a war they were trying to stay on the edges of, and a 72-hour window coming up that's probably going to tell us more about where this entire conflict is heading than the last 2 weeks combined. I'll be here tracking every development as it happens, so make sure you're subscribed. Keep the notifications on, and I'll see you in the next one when we find out exactly which direction this goes.